What's up, Rovers? Our sweetest acolyte of the Order, Phoebe, has arrived in version 2.1, and gosh, I didn't know we had card captors in this game too. Despite her appearance, this bubbly and squishy girl puts up quite a fight. She's our newest Spectro DPS, putting out numbers competitive with the best, like Carlotta, Jinhsi, Camellia, etc. But she's also quite different from other units. Let's take this trip together and find out why. Today's guide has taken over 50 hours as usual to make. If you found this video helpful, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. As a reminder, full team breakdowns have been moved to a separate video follow-up. This guide will still mention her best teammates and how the teams play, but nuances on gearing and rotations for them will be saved for the next video. Now we'll cover Phoebe's team role and main mechanics first, then the typical deeper dive. Forte Priorities come after, and then echo stuff. Mainstats, substats, and I know some of you will be wondering how the new Spectro set compares to Celestial Light. Don't worry, we'll get there. Then we have weapon comparisons, endgame stat goals, and her sequences breakdown. We'll end with her rotations, and a short summary of her team setups. Let's dive right in. Phoebe is perhaps the one member of the Order we can all agree on is definitely a good person. Polite, quiet, and organized, this all reflects in her kit as well, in the form of geometric shapes, mirrors, lasers, and even her own personal bonk stick. All of these tools are used together to produce high, consistent damage in her rotation. Phoebe does not front load, mid, or back load her DPS, and thus all parts of her rotation are important. As a compromise, Phoebe probably has the highest amount of quick swaps and animation cancels of any unit released in the game so far. Thus, while her rotation is straightforward for consistent damage, she has both a low skill floor and an extremely high skill ceiling. Phoebe is the first character in the game to also release with two kits, one for sub DPS and one for main DPS. Unfortunately, at the time of her release, her sub DPS mode is not useful since you sacrifice 1/3 of her damage output to apply and buff a ton of fragile stacks on the enemy. Currently, there's no one in the game that can take advantage of this, so confession mode will not be the main highlight of this video. Don't worry, we'll still explain it and go over its calcs and rotations. In contrast, her DPS mode, Absolution, deals sky-high damage, but is entirely reliant on spectral fragile stacks being present on the enemy to access her higher multipliers, and newsflash, she can barely apply it herself in DPS mode. Thus, all meta Phoebe comps are currently joined at the hip to Spectro Rover for funneling spectral fragile stacks for her, until a future fragile stacker or fragile DPS unit is released. If you don't play Spectro Rover with her, Phoebe will be forced to alternate between Confession and Absolution mode to self-funnel fragile stacks so she can DPS, which is a huge damage loss. Her raw damage output on Absolution mode is currently higher than anybody in the game, roughly 10% higher than Carlotta and 15% higher than Jinhsi. However, this is intentional, since her team comps lack most amplifier outro buffers that are useful. Phoebe teams focus on team-wide weaker buffs, rather than funneling everything into her with bigger buffs as a traditional hyper carry. As a result, despite her personal multipliers in a vacuum being higher than everybody else, the overall team performance is roughly similar. After all team buffs are considered, a typical Phoebe team will parse like Carlotta, Jinhsi, and Camellia top teams. On Quickswap teams, she has a lot of potential in the future due to her cancel and backswap windows. As more time passes with more fragile units releasing, more tech will also be discovered, and I expect Phoebe teams to surpass our old DPS ceilings, being Jinhsi, Carlotta, Camellia, etc., just due to the nature of how dot mechanics scale. Okay, so how does Phoebe work? As explained earlier, Phoebe has two main modes, Absolution and Confession. Absolution is her DPS mode with raw damage, whereas Confession is her sub-DPS mode focusing on dots. Even if you use up their new Forte resource, Divine Voice, you will permanently stay in the previous mode you selected until the next time you choose. Most importantly, the character animations for each mode are identical. Only the attack special effects differ. This means the timelines regardless of modes are near identical. Just note that Confession grants more Concerto and allows her to rotate faster. Moreover, besides using heavy attack to enter Absolution or holding skill to enter Confession, both modes use the exact same control inputs to do their rotations, making Phoebe simple to learn no matter which mode you use. This means you want to cast Absolution or Confession earlier in her rotation because it determines her moveset later onwards, as well as special multipliers. Your ult deals more damage in Absolution and applies more Spectral Fragile when in Confession. When in either mode, it also grants you access to heavy Star Flash after every full basic chain. This big AoE is your bread and butter of her kit mechanics. In Absolution, it does big damage, In Confession, it applies a ton of Spectro Frazzle stacks. Without picking a mode, this move is completely unavailable. Phoebe can also use her normal skill to place a Ring of Mirrors. Now this time stops up to 12 enemies it hits for 2 seconds each. Shooting your basic into this will grant extra hits that do a tiny bit more damage, but more importantly groups any enemies except bosses inside towards the middle. Yes, she has a built-in spammable grouping tool. Using your basics while inside the ring will instead spawn a bunch of sky lasers that deal more damage, and have a much bigger AoE. The second basic inside a ring can also time stop enemies that are not currently in an attack animation for 1 second. Casting Resonant skill a second time within 12 seconds when you're outside of it will teleport you inside. This has insane range, letting you teleport even the entire distance of the arena in TOA. Finally, Phoebe's outro has different effects for each mode, dealing insane amounts of damage in Absolution, and stacking and amplifying Frazzle stacks in Confession. Let's look at Forte Priorities next. The vast majority of her damage comes from her Forte Circuit Star Flash, so you absolutely want to level that first. Note that even though Star Flash is heavy damage, almost nothing else on her kit is. As a result, Phoebe does not really have a preferred damage type, as she's only about 45% heavy damage. While it's nice to have, Attack Flat is still much better on her. If you're using Absolution mode, Liberation is your second priority, as it significantly outdamages your skill tree moveset, which normally includes your sky lasers inside of your ring. In Confession mode, it is weaker than anything else in your kit except intro and can be ignored. Otherwise, skill tree is a higher priority than your normal attack tree, both because skill tree's higher damage output, but also because you're more likely to use your basic attacks inside the ring, which come from the skill tree, than outside the ring, which come from the normal tree. Now, these are not useless, you still will want to level both skill and normal tree to at least 6. Still lost on how her Forte circuit works? No worries, let's dig a little deeper. Phoebe's Forte meter has 2 modes, Prayer and Divine Voice. Prayer is the default mode which charges automatically without you needing to do anything. It takes 24 seconds to full charge and instantly begins charging in the background when you use it. When full, Casting Heavy will use Absolution Litany, a gold card explosion, and enter Absolution mode. Casting Hold Skill instead will use Utter Confession, a blue card explosion, and enter Confession mode. Both modes last forever until the next mode cast. Both modes will refill her Forte bar with Divine Voice used to cast Star Flash. Both modes are instantly available in TOA and other content because Phoebe always starts by default with a full prayer bar. This allows you to instantly go into Absolution or Confession mode at the very beginning of the run. The main reason for picking a mode is granting you access to heavy Star Flash after every full basic chain. Absolution mode makes Star Flash deal sky-high damage, whereas Confession mode makes it apply a bunch of Frazzle stacks. You can cast 4 Star Flashes per Absolution mode and 2 Star Flashes per Confession mode before her Forte runs out. Phoebe's Liberation Bonk Stick is simple. By default, it does somewhat low damage, but in Absolution it hits 3.55 times harder, aka big PP damage. In Confession, it deals no extra damage, but it applies 8 Frazzle stacks. Confession ult is not really useful for anything currently, as she already applies more than enough Frazzle stacks from Star Flash spam. Absolution mode is a good chunk of damage, but don't expect to hit higher than 200k if you don't have her signature. Even with Sig, it only hits for about 250k. Phoebe's Resonant skill tree consists of 2 parts, the Ring of Mirrors, and basic attacks used inside the ring. Skill cast itself places Ring of Mirrors on top of your closest enemy or in front of you, lasting 30 seconds. It time stops anything it hits up to 12 enemies for 2 seconds. If you cast it again within 12 seconds, you can teleport inside of it with huge range, basically across an entire TOA arena. Using basic attacks into the ring pulls motion values from the normal attack tree, but also spawns rebounding mirror shots that deal a tiny bit of extra damage scaling off of this skill tree. But using basic attacks inside of the ring uses motion values from this skill tree, Camille's Star. The second hit has an unlisted effect where it time stops enemies the star hits for 1 second if they aren't already in an attack animation. All of Camille's Star's basic attacks hit harder than Phoebe's default basic attacks used outside her ring, as well as having better AoE. In bossing content, usually you will want to be inside of your ring for higher damage and free time stops unless the boss is super aggro and constantly blocks your camera. Phoebe's normal attack tree consists of her out-of-circle basic attacks, the ordinary lasers, her aerials, heavies, and both versions of her dodge counter. Yes, for some reason her Camille Star dodge counter comes from this tree instead of her Resonant skill tree. All of her basic attacks can parry, despite being a rectifier user. You usually only use this tree when attacking from outside of a ring, and most commonly used in mobbing content like Whimpering Waves or Pincer. But do note that upkeeping Phoebe's damage in those type of content is very difficult. Her ground heavy isn't really useful for anything, or her burial attack, albeit it looks cool. Now, aerial heavy lets her fly forwards, usable up to twice before landing if you have her inherent skill. Phoebe's intro doesn't do anything special. In fact, it's actually incapable of parrying, making it the least important part of her kit. It also doesn't activate anything. It has a slightly long animation time too compared to most intros in the game, so there really isn't anything good I can say about it. Phoebe's outro hits like a truck and is the strongest one in the game. It has a base motion value of 528%, which is already kind of decent. Now, this is multiplied by 3.55 times when in Absolution mode, going all the way up to 1875% motion value, or in other words, hits about as strong as most DPS ults. For perspective, remember Carlotta's outro? That dealt about 60k damage on a good build. Yeah, that's a 794% motion value. Phoebe's outro in Absolution is well over double that. In Confession mode, it grants your team a 10% Spectro Shred aura, makes Frazzle deal double damage, and tick every 4.5 seconds instead of every 3, all for 30 seconds. Now, the way it works is it takes 3.5 seconds to perform 8 hits, and if you swap back to Phoebe during it, you will be stuck in her spinny animation. It has a 1.5 seconds wide up, then 2 seconds spent dealing damage every quarter second, casted directly on top of the closest enemy and slowly passing through them. Phoebe's inherent skills are quality of life plus a little more DPS. The first one is very simple. Presence simply lets her use an aerial heavy one extra time. This is her flying staff move used for funny exploration. Looks pretty nice too. Revelation is a simple buff that applies plus 12% Spectro to Phoebe when she's in Absolution or Confession state. Because she never leaves the previous state she's in after you cast it, the only time this won't be active is when you first start an arena encounter, like TOA or Whimpering Wastes. For minor nodes, Phoebe brings 12% attack and 16% crit damage. Pretty chill to build, but you want to make sure that you can get her crit rate high enough so she can hit 100%. Echo set discussion time. You should be using the new Spectro set on Phoebe, Eternal Radiance. This makes her DPS a lot more consistent since it can easily hit 100% crit rate with multiple different combinations of setups for less molding and resets even if you don't have her signature or Stringmaster. It's also noticeably higher damage than Celestial Light, albeit the gap isn't as big as, say, Carlotta Frosty Resolve vs Freezing Frost. Now, you lose on average 7 to 12% total damage on Phoebe by using old Spectral set instead of the new one, assuming identical substats, weapons, and team. Note that the Eternal Radiance 5-piece effect only grants a plus 20% crit rate buff to yourself if the equipper procs Spectral Frazzle. You cannot use a different unit to grant crit rate to Phoebe, and by extension, obviously Jinhsi can't use this buff either, which is why people don't recommend it. But this is why Eternal Radiance only works on some characters that can apply Frazzle themselves to get the plus 20% crit rate. Yes, the plus 15% Spectral 5-piece effect doesn't need you to proc Frazzle yourself, but that's a pretty garbage 5-piece buff by itself if you can't also get the 20% crit rate. This is why we have a problem because Phoebe can only proc Frazzle once in Absolution mode, and that's from the initial Absolution Litany cast, so you do want to be careful and only cast it as close to her DPS phase as possible. Additionally, Nightmare Ikes is a summon with no cast animations, whereas Morning Ikes is a transformation, further expanding the gap between the two sets. Also make sure to only cast Nightmare Ikes when the enemy already has Frazzle, as this will make it deal double damage. For Phoebe, double Spectro 3 costs are always the best choice. This is because Eternal Radiance gives less element percent bonus than your typical Sonata set, to balance out the plus 20% crit rate. Additionally, even her signature only gives a respective 42% damage type bonus to basic and heavy attacks. This is the lowest damage percent setup we've had for a main DPS yet, and thus is not a saturated stat, meaning Spectral percent is always worth more than attack percent on all Phoebe builds. Granted, the gap isn't massive, and Spectro attack is still very viable, as it only trails 2 to 4% behind double Spectro, regardless of your weapon choice. As always, pick the one with the better substats. Phoebe is only about 45% heavy damage and 15 to 20% basic damage. As a result, heavy and basic rolls actually scale rather poorly on her, and attack flat is still significantly superior. Avoid rolling these intentionally unless they come up for free alongside attack. For energy, a single ER roll is generally enough for Phoebe, however missing attacks can cost you some energy. Realistically, while Phoebe is playable if you have a perfect 105 ER, I recommend 110 for experts, and 115 if you want something more comfortable. 120 is unnecessary overkill and basically lets you ult whenever you want regardless of proper rotations. Phoebe is probably one of the most free-to-play friendly DPSs we've ever had for gearing, with easy team building and even easier weapon choices. While her signature is obviously cut above the rest, there are many competitive options with similar scaling to the standard 5-star rectifier, Cosmic Ripples. On top of this, the current limited time event weapon in 2.1, featuring Ocean's Gift, is free to max refine and is basically equal to Cosmic Ripples. The first table here is for Eternal Radiance with weapons, whereas the second one is on the Celestial Light setup. Now, I only recommend using Eternal Radiance on Phoebe, but if you are still using Celestial Light for some reason, these are the weapon comparisons for it too. Got it? Let's take a look at each weapon. Luminous Hymn is a weapon that looks a lot better than it seems, and parses about 19 to 20% higher overall damage versus Cosmic Ripples. However, it's also the one future-proof weapon that gets better over time, which I'll get to later. On the surface, Luminous Hymn gives a truckload of basic and heavy damage as its gimmick, 42% for each. Basic and heavy damage, though, only make up a total of 61% of her DPS at S0R1, and only one of these two buffs can apply at a time. Contrast this to, say, Camellia, whose signature grants 70% basic on a kit that consists of 75% basic damage. Or in fact, contrast Luminous Hymn to even Yao, whose signature is only seen as good because it's the only 4-star or above crit stick gauntlet. It gives 48% liberation damage on a kit who consists of 55 to 60% liberation damage. Therefore, I only consider Luminous Hymn at face value to be a decent signature that neither impresses or disappoints, as in truth, its scaling is modest at 19 to 20% overall damage increase versus Cosmic Ripples. Most signatures range from plus 16 to 20%. Then we have outliers like Jinhsi's weapon parse 23% higher or some others. Thus, the real long game is actually the 30% Frazzle Amplify and outro to the entire team for 30 seconds. This is currently useless because Phoebe's Absolution applies only one stack in her rotation and has no way to scale it, and expects 5 to 10 stack uptime due to Spectro Rover, but nobody really has a way to funnel or consume these stacks to get bigger damage. Phoebe only uses it as a checklist to make sure her Star Flash hits harder. Confession itself is bad until we get a proper Frazzle DPS. But once we do, what if we get a DPS that increases the maximum amount of allowed Frazzle stacks on an enemy? What if we get a DPS that can rapidly detonate the sum total of Frazzle stacks with their kit? You know, kind of like a Kafka from Star Rail. All of a sudden, this outro passive on Phoebe's signature starts looking a lot more significant. You know, Kuro never introduces useless stuff on purpose in Wuwa. There is probably some gimmick setup coming in the distant future related to Frazzle DPS itself, and not just resonator damage. On the bright side, reruns in Wuwa only take about 4 months. This means I don't recommend grabbing Luminous Hymn right now just because of this future possible synergy, but rather to not forget this outro passive on the weapon exists, and keeping an eye out for it in the future to see how it relates to future Spectro units. Now, Stringmaster is a complicated topic. In casual Phoebe rotations, it should be about 12 to 13% better than Cosmic Ripples. This is due to low uptime on the 2 stacks on the plus 12% attack passive. Note that each skill cast grants 2 stacks as they hit twice, and Stringmaster doesn't have a cooldown between hits. However, there are sweatier rotations that allow you to consistently have 2 stacks of Stringmaster's passive all the way through to the first half of Phoebe's basic plus Star Flash sequence by using the double hit on initial skill cast and another double hit on the teleport, and playing well enough to not lose time on rotations. And then you can also cast it again right before she outros. This increases Stringmaster's parse to 18% better than Cosmic Ripples, or just 1% behind her signature, but obviously is harder to play. Therefore, those that are willing to put in sweatier rotations for higher damage will also be rewarded by better performance from Stringmaster itself, and thus will not need to pull for her signature. Be aware that Stringmaster's off-field passive only works on a fully despawned character, and it will not buff Quickswap Star Flash casts on Phoebe, nor her outro ticks, as you can see here. Rhyme Drape Sprouts is a generic basic percent rectifier parsing 9% higher damage than Cosmic Ripples. Because Phoebe deals less than 20% basic, most of this passive is wasted. The main highlight is 72% crit damage, allowing you to get monster crit stats while still reaching 100% crit rate if your crit rate substats are good enough on Eternal Radiance. Cosmic Ripples also grants 12.8% ER, which is normally worth another attack percent substat on most DPS. However, because Phoebe barely needs ER at all, it devalues Cosmic Ripples' ER passive, since most players will already have the single ER roll needed to begin with. Augmented R5 parses equal to Cosmic Ripples because of the busted passive granting plus 48% attack after Liberation cast, which is typically front-loaded in Phoebe's rotations. Because refinements on Battle Pass weapons scale higher than normal, Augment is only really notable at max Refine. Now, equal to R5 Augment and R1 Cosmic Ripples, we have the Event Weapon, Ocean's Gift, parsing at 99%. This is the Spectro percent buff version of the craftable Waltz and Masquerade, which grants attack percent instead. Because Phoebe is lacking in damage percent stats due to the Eternal Radiance set compared to most DPS, Ocean's Gift is superior to the crafted weapon. You get all 5 copies for free, so long as you complete the version 2.1 fishing event within the patch. So if you're on a budget, make sure to do this limited as soon as possible. Fusion Accretion and Shorekeepers are your other weaker 4-star alternatives, alongside Guardian Rectifier and Rectifier of Night as your best 3-star option. If you manage to achieve all that we've discussed so far, then our endgame substats should look a little bit like this. Do keep in mind these are scaled to level 90 with maxed out Forte, so it can take some time to reach this. Phoebe sequences affect both Absolution and Confession modes with differing effects. Most focus on directly increasing her DPS or buffs and do not typically have any supportive or quality of life effects for her own rotation. This means her gameplay will remain near identical in mechanics and rotation no matter how many sequences you invest in. All math was done assuming our 1 Luminous him. Note that all values are quoted in vacuum and will be slightly diluted in full team comp rotations. Her main stopping points are S2, S3, which is probably the strongest S3 in the game, and S6. S1 just makes her Absolution Liberation hit harder. You go from 3.55 times overall to 5.8 times overall. In other words, expect the bonk stick with full team buffs for 250 to 300k with no sig, and 350 to 400k with sig. In Confession mode, it instead makes her bonk stick hit 90% harder, but it's pretty weak by default without the Absolution buff, so this doesn't really matter. It also applies max frazzle allowed, which is currently 10 instead of the standard 8, which also doesn't really matter. Perhaps we'll receive a character in the future that can increase the maximum amount of frazzle stacks allowed on a target. S1 is about a 9% damage increase for Absolution and Confession modes. Her S2 makes Absolution mode outro deal 2.2 times more damage, after it already deals a motion value of 1,875. Thus, you can expect it to do 35 to 40k per tick now with full team buffs, totaling to over 300k damage overall. Confession mode outro amplifies Team Spectro Frazzle by 3.2 times instead of 2 times at S2. Note that the Confession Amplify will be a lot more useful in the future if we get another character that can scale or detonate Frazzle stacks. Currently, S2 in Absolution mode is 19% better than S1, and 1.29 times as strong as S0. S2 in Confession mode is 8% better than S1, and 1.18 times as strong as S0. S3 is the biggest damage jump ever recorded since Wuwa launched for a character. In Absolution, it grants Phoebe Starflash motion value multiplier by 91%. Basically, her biggest move that you spam 4 times of rotation now deals almost double damage. In Confession mode, it gives a much bigger motion value buff, or 249% to the same move. But remember that Confession mode lacks the huge built-in 256% amplifier on Starflash. So even though her S3 is massive for Confession, it's still much less actual raw damage versus Absolution. S3 in Absolution mode is a 28% damage increase over S2, and 1.66 times as strong as S0. S3 in Confession mode is a 32% damage increase over S2, and 1.56 times as strong as S0. S4 is a simple 10% Spectro Shred whenever Phoebe hits the enemy with any kind of basic attack or dodge counter, including the Camille Star variants. This is an 11 to 12% damage increase for both modes over S3. S4 Absolution mode is 1.85 times as strong as S0, and S4 Confession mode is 1.75 times as strong as S0. S5 is a simple plus 12% spectral buff for herself whenever Phoebe casts her intro skill. It's just a stepping stone for S6, being just a 4 to 5% damage increase in both modes. S5's Absolution is 1.93 times as strong as S0, and S5 Confession mode is 1.82 times as strong as S0. S6 makes her Ring of Mirrors time stop better, lasting 4 seconds on cast instead of 2 seconds. It can still only time stop 12 enemies per cast. It does not improve the unlisted 1 second time stop of Camille's Star Basic 2 on enemies not in attack animations. Casting Ring of Mirrors while in Absolution or Confession also now grants a 10% attack buff for 20 seconds, and auto triggers a Star Flash cast on the Mirror Ring at no Divine Voice cost. It is not considered a heavy attack input, and it cannot activate effects of anything relying on heavy attacks. This can easily be casted twice in Absolution mode for 2 extra Star Flashes, but you might have to cast Absolution slightly earlier, as I will show in the S6 rotation later. For Confession mode, it is still possible for Phoebe to cast 2 Ring of Mirrors per rotation, despite her skill having a 12 seconds cooldown and the Confession rotation only taking 7 seconds. This is done by precasting her skill earlier out of rotation, while Rover quickswaps every 5 to 10 seconds to cast Forte skill for Shimmer plus Frazzle stacks. Because Phoebe normally only casts 2 Star Flashes on Confession versus 4 times on Absolution mode, S6 has a much bigger DPS increase on Confession mode, letting it catch up on relative performance to S0. This means Absolution mode jumps from 1.93 to 2.24 times damage at S5 to S6, whereas Confession mode jumps from 1.82 to 2.25 times. It's time to go over Phoebe's rotations. She has a standard Absolution rotation that anybody can use easily. However, because Phoebe's animations are so quick swap and cancel friendly, there's a lot of time save available that can be used in alternate rotations. We will also go over the S6 rotation variants at the end of this section. No matter how Phoebe is played, her main goal is to use heavy Absolution litany or skill utter confession when at 120 prayer, which takes 24 seconds to recharge that you also have by default at the beginning of instance combat, to enter their respective modes and restore Divine Voice on her Forte bar. This grants her access to Star Flash, which is either her main source of damage in Absolution, or main source of generating Spectral Frazzle stacks in Confession. Phoebe barely generates enough Concerto, so missing moves would result in her being unable to outro once her final Star Flash is cast. Be careful how you play her, because this can impact your team rotation times. For an all-purpose Absolution rotation that is not dependent on Quickswap, you simply intro Phoebe and cast Absolution Litany to enter DPS mode. Note that you never actually leave Absolution, but this move deals enough damage that it's always worth casting on subsequent rotations. Then cast your Nightmare Ikes and skill so that you gain access to Camille's Star moveset, and animation cancel with Liberation. If you're not inside your ring, then you can recast skill to teleport to it if needed. You then proceed to cast Camille's Star 3 times basics and pre-hold heavy to cast Star Flash, and repeat this 4 times until your Forte bar is depleted and you outro. Simple and easy, right? For Quickswap Phoebe, things change a little bit. Absolution mode is only able to apply 1 single Frazzle stack, which comes from heavy Absolution Litany. This is your only way to grant yourself the 5-piece Eternal Radiance plus 20% crit rate buff, but it only lasts 15 seconds. Therefore, because of many Phoebe's moves take a long time to cast, you want to swap or animation cancel them, including Absolution Litany. However, you cannot use Absolution too early because you only have 15 seconds after you cast it to do Phoebe's entire rotation if you want to retain the entire crit buff. Therefore, we instead open with Phoebe's Ring of Mirrors skill cast. This is used for possible repositioning later if needed to guarantee we're inside of a ring to use her stronger basic attacks that have better damage, better AoE, and better cancel windows. It is assumed that Spectro Rover is joined at the hip to Phoebe teams right now for Spectral Frazzle generation and allow Phoebe to remain in DPS mode. Note that Liberation freezes all timers in game except swap cooldowns continuing to run down even if it visually doesn't show. This means you can cast Absolution Litany, immediately swap to Rover to cast Liberation and apply 6 Frazzle stacks, while also removing Phoebe's swap cooldown and immediately swap back to her, all while timers are stopped and Absolution's animation plays out. This allows us to continue Phoebe's rotation without any time loss at all, since the original moment we casted Absolution Litany. Now this setup hinges on Rover using Liberation as one of their final actions to intro Phoebe and thus would look like this at full speed. We can use the skill teleport after Phoebe intros to reposition for better damage and instantly cancel before we appear, but after we teleport with her ult. Teleport takes 22 frames and damage happens after an extra 60 frames for 82 frames total at 60 FPS. Thus, we Liberation cancel at the 22 frames mark because Phoebe's teleport can spawn your collision box on top of enemies in the air, preventing you from taking any action. The damage of the teleport also sucks and is slow, thus it's not worth waiting it out to complete and deal damage. Now once you cast your Liberation, you just do your typical Camille's basic 1-2-3 plus Star Flash 4 times before you outro. If you kill enemies along the way in between, make sure you bring Rover back in to reapply Frazzle. If you're playing a triple TPS comp, you can even weave other character movesets inside of your Star Flash cast, like this. For the Confession, a Quickswap rotation is very similar, but just shorter. Because it only takes about 7 seconds for the Confession rotation, maintaining Eternal Radiance's 5-piece plus 20% crit rate buff is a lot easier than Absolution mode. You still want to swap cancel her ring cast in Utter Confession. You can swap Liberation cancel, just like I showed earlier if you're going to Phoebe intro after Utter Confession. Teleport can be cancelled by her own Liberation again, and then you can do your 2x basic 1-2-3 plus Star Flash combo before outroing. Now, at S6, the only difference in Phoebe rotations is leading her Quickswap with Absolution or Confession cast before you normally place her Ring of Mirrors skill. This is required for the S6 to activate an extra Star Flash cast on the first rotation. Because Phoebe never leaves the mode she's in, on the second rotation onwards, you no longer need to cast Absolution or Confession before casting your Ring of Mirror skill and can go back to the normal rotations for the bonus Star Flash hit. But you will always have to cast a Ring of Mirrors again at the very end of a rotation before you outro, because it should be off cooldown, and this grants you the second extra Star Flash. For Confession rotations, you can still get 2 extra Star Flashes by just early casting Ring of Mirrors about 5 to 6 seconds before you would have introed Phoebe. Now, besides swap cancelling or Liberation cancelling Phoebe's Ring of Mirrors cast, Absolution Litany, or Skill Teleport, you can also echo cancel all of them with the normal Morning Ikes if you're still using Celestial Light set. You can also swap cancel Ikes to a different character to achieve the same rotation time in Quickswap as an Eternal Radiance Phoebe. Additionally, you can dodge cancel Phoebe's third basic attack regardless of Camille's star. This is because Star Flash is guaranteed on third basic cast, not third basic hit. Be aware, her normal Laser Beam Basic 3 outside of her ring is very slow to come out, and you can cancel it early to insta-cast Star Flash, but this will completely skip both the Basic 3 Laser and also the Concerto associated with it, making you unable to outro properly if you do this unless you dodge countered somewhere along the way. If you instead dodge cancel her Camille's basic 3 inside her ring, the Sky Laser, as you can see, spawns a lot sooner in her animation than the normal Laser basic 3 animation outside of her ring, which means you can easily get an early Star Flash cast with a dodge cancel while retaining the entire Sky Laser hit for more damage and respective Concerto generation. Dodge cancelling inside the ring can be done 5 frames after Camille's Star Basic 3 begins, so in practice you can dodge near instantly as her legs drop when she hops back. This will save up to 0.6 seconds each time you do it, and you can do it 4 times per rotation. Thus, Quickswap Phoebe DPS should generally be played from inside her Ring of Mirrors rather than outside, to prevent Concerto loss and get better cancel windows. Do not dodge cancel her Star Flash. It is possible, but it's extremely risky to do so with very tight windows. Succeeding saves 0.1 seconds, and failing bricks your rotation by not using your Forte bar and resets your basic chain and taking away your Star Flash casts and wasting 2.5 seconds. You can also pre-hold heavy right before you swap to Phoebe to cast Absolution Litany without needing to basic 1, but the timing on this is tight. More information on animation cancels are available on my Phoebe spreadsheet. As a reminder, the in-depth version of Phoebe's team building will be in a separate video, since it takes an enormous amount of time to get team data and rotations done. If you want an early peek, I already refined most of the team rotations in the Phoebe spreadsheet. Phoebe prefers Shorekeeper over Verina because her prayer reset to gain access to Divine Voice for Star Flash spam takes 24 seconds to recharge. Additionally, Shorekeeper makes it a lot easier for Phoebe to consistently hit 100% crit rate so you never miss. Less run resets equals less molding. A 67.5% crit rate Phoebe is enough to hit 100% with just 5-piece Eternal Radiance and Shorekeeper Stella round. Because Phoebe is reliant on Spectro Frazzle to be present on the enemy for Absolution mode to deal relevant damage, Spectro Rover is currently joined at the hip to Phoebe. Otherwise, you will have to alternate between Confession and Absolution mode each full team rotation, resulting in massive DPS loss for Phoebe. Rover should have about 120 to 125 ER to Liberation every rotation. Everyone has Spectro Rover, so please use her with Phoebe if you're gonna play her. Hypercarry Phoebe works a lot better in bossing scenarios, whereas Quickswap Phoebe is mandatory in wave-based content, because again, she is relying on Spectro Rover to reapply Spectral Frazzle on new waves, as Phoebe cannot do so well in Absolution, besides her initial Absolution Litany cast. There is a relatively small gap between Eternal Radiance, Celestial Light, or Moonlit Clouds on Spectro Rover for overall team performance. This is because Rover at best can output only about 25% of the team's total DPS, whereas Phoebe typically makes up at least 70%. Just be aware that non-Moonlit Clouds is more flexible due to always having full uptime on buffs, whereas Moonlit needs you to reapply hair and outro every single time you want Phoebe to do bigger damage, thus is more timeline sensitive on wave spawns. Eternal Radiance has better quality of life than Celestial Light, but does barely extra damage on Rover, because her kit wasn't designed to be biased to the new Echo set, unlike Phoebe. Rover already gets plus 15% crit rate for free from S1 anyways. I would recommend Eternal Radiance in the long run for Rover, because you will probably want to run 2x Radiance sets on Phoebe and maybe Zanny, assuming they synergize, because we know somebody has to. Hint hint. Whoever it's going to be, they're most likely going to have a disproportionate DPS advantage on Eternal Radiance versus Celestial Light. Rover can technically also play healer set to replace Verina on Shorekeeper, but I wouldn't recommend doing this. Weaker heals, more complicated rotations, and needing higher investment on Rover to deal raw damage and make up for lack of buffs. Now, the third slot on the team has several options. Verina or Shorekeeper is the default option. I don't think I really need to explain anymore why they fit these teams, besides the fact that Shorekeeper makes it easier for Phoebe to hit 100% crit by stacking with her 5-piece Eternal Radiance crit buff. Alternative third slots include Mortefi, Sanhua, and Roccia. Now, Mortefi appears to be a best-in-slot buffer for Phoebe, but has a serious problem. His outro grants 38% heavy damage amplified to the next resonator. Phoebe actually already has plus 256% amplify built into her base kit for Starflash, her main source of DPS. Thus, this actually dilutes Mortefi's outro severely, as they're additive to each other rather than multiplicative. In reality, Mortefi's outro only results in about 11% more damage per Starflash instead of the 38%. Thus, the only reason to use Mortefi on Phoebe teams is because your Sanhua is already caught up with somebody else. His long rotations contrast Sanhua's ease of use for speedy Concerto, and thus requires a ton of effort and Quickswap to bring his team up to par and perform similarly. While Phoebe only deals about 15 to 20% of her DPS as basic damage, this is good enough to make her damage increase on Sanhua comparable to Mortefi comp, since her 38% basic buff isn't diluted on Phoebe's basic attacks. Roccia offers a side option for excessive amounts of grouping and wave content like Whimpering Waves, where it can use Rover as a Frazzle bot and using a token to reset skill cooldown, of which both Rover and Roccia depend on, double stacking Roccia and Phoebe DPS outside of the ring to make sure enemies are always grouped together. Now, placement of Phoebe's ring in this kind of content will literally make or break your run. For Quickswap Phoebe, the main highlights are currently Jinhsi and Changli. Jinhsi works due to brute forcing. This team lacks cord hits and thus scales off of mono element comp, abusing Spectral team-wide buffs and Spectral Shred. Because the entire team consists of DPS units, we still get competitive damage. The Jinhsi team is very hard to play, but has equal if not slightly better damage output than the Phoebe Rover with Verina and Shorekeeper. For those that want the ultimate adrenaline shot on Quickswap Phoebe gameplay, this team might scratch your itch. I have the rotation for this one posted in the spreadsheets. For Changli, it's rather simple. She does not really benefit from any of the buffs in this team, however can easily fit each of her skill casts, ult, and flaming sacrifices inside of Phoebe's numerous skill, heavy, and Starflash casts. You only really need to find time to manually acquire one extra Inflatement stack, but if you give Rover Overture, you can run double intro Changli to completely eliminate the need for this. Quite hard to play, but a bit easier than Jinhsi team, and is also a bit lower DPS due to lacking buff synergies. Thank you so much for watching through this entire video. I hope this Phoebe guide has been useful for deciding whether to pull on her banner. As a reminder, all spreadsheets documenting my testing can be found in the description and pinned comment. Do feel free to make a copy if you want to change values and test stuff. Cheers! As this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos. You don't miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this one. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you all next time.